All right, guys, this is Jimmy with Hifly Fitness, and today we have Alex Viada of CompleteHumanPerformance.com. He's an elite powerlifter and as well as a ultra marathon runner, triathlete, basically something that you don't see a lot in this sport. So I figured it'd be a good idea to interview him today. So Alex, why you can introduce yourself and just tell him.
Sure. Yeah, like you said, my name is Alex Viada. I run a company called CompleteHumanPerformance.com. I've been doing this, we've been around for almost 3 years now. Basic overall philosophy, what we've always tried to do is properly integrate strength sports and endurance sports. A lot of the people we work with, I'd say the biggest single group we work with is the military. Work with a lot of CrossFit athletes, work with a lot of strongmen, a lot of these different groups that I think up until now always had the sense that you had to do either strength or endurance, and one or the other would certainly suffer. So it's been a fun few years. We've had the opportunity to work with some very, very interesting, very cool athletes, and it's been kind of a whole new science.
Awesome. Okay, so I think one of the things we need to get out of the way about how cardio and endurance training can actually help potentially your strength training or powerlifting goals. Maybe you could touch on that. Exactly what is the misconceptions that are out there about it?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, one of the things you see the most is obviously you hear the idea that any amount of cardiovascular training, endurance training is obviously going to immediately kill your strength, immediately rob you of your size and everything else. And I think that is an old misconception. I mean, that's one of these things that technically is true, but there are so many other factors at work when you start to incorporate cardiovascular training, and so many other factors in recovery that you can control for. And if you can construct the routine properly, obviously this is not something that's going to happen. So obviously there's, in terms of the positive effects, obviously there's the general health effect. One of the biggest things that I love about doing this is that a lot of the power lifters that we work with, and a lot of the previously, I don't want to say out of shape individuals, but individuals without much cardio capacity, they come up to us afterwards and say, this is fantastic. I can go up 3 flights of stairs and not feel out of breath. I can play with my kids, things like that. So there's obviously the lifestyle health benefit to it. But there's also something that I want to touch on, and that's basically the work capacity. Obviously, what does work capacity mean? It can mean anything to a number of different sports, but as far as I'm concerned, there's no athlete out there who won't benefit from being able to recover a bit faster between sets, being able to work out just a bit longer with a bit more intensity, and essentially being able to recover a little bit faster and condense more work into a shorter period of time.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Okay. So one of the hypotheses that I think Mark Riptoto talks about is, I think it's a 1995 study. It's a dated study about how your muscle fibers actually reduce in size, and therefore your strength is reduced. So by doing cardio, it'll reduce your gains. So exactly how is that? How and why is that? The study is basically not viable for what you know about it.
Well, so I think what a lot of that refers to is if you look at the adaptations of quote-unquote type 1 muscle fibers, which actually we're finding now, separate fiber types don't actually exist. It's actually more of a continuum of fiber types with certain clusters, exhibiting certain characteristics. But if you look at what you could typically consider the slow twitch muscle fibers, one of the adaptations to pure endurance training is that the fibers actually will reduce in cross-sectional area, which allows proportionally greater blood flow to the area, more oxygen to the muscle fibers, etc. So it actually makes them more efficient. But if you combine strength training with that, of course, these adaptations are not going to happen, certainly not to that extent. This is obviously one of the reasons why you don't find too many 200-pound elite marathoners, of course, because you need those adaptations, certainly to be able to do extremely long-distance cardiovascular activity at maximum efficiency. But simply the introduction of cardiovascular conditioning to a strength athlete, that particular adaptation is not in any way, this is not going to prioritize over everything that's needed to fuel muscle contraction, your maximum muscle contraction. So it's one of these things that theoretically, yes, is true. This is one adaptive pathway that can happen, but this is in a very specific kind of athlete, and obviously it's in the absence of resistance training.
So if a powerlifter wanted to start running, or they wanted maybe compete in a marathon, I don't know that that would actually happen because it's such a small niche that would do both things. But if they were to add somewhat like a 10-mile run to their training, why or like how exactly could they prevent that strength decrease through different recovery methods?
Well, one of the most critical things to look at, obviously, is I think one of the biggest problems that people do is you look at a lot of powerlifters and how strength athletes structure their training. They don't max out every day. They don't do high volume every day. They typically do some sort of periodization, whether it's daily undulating periodization, the West Side style, complex parallel, conjugate, whatever, what have you. That's that idea of a rotating stimulus, which I think is very important to do for endurance training as well. Simply throwing in, starting out and saying, I'm just going to go run 5 miles, having never done it before, the metabolic stress on the body is going to be huge. A lot of powerlifters are not very efficient. I certainly know when I started running, I kind of looked like a slightly dysfunctional hippopotamus.
Yeah.
That hasn't changed that much, but it's a little better.
Yeah.
So one of the main things is, of course, slowly ease into it. I think a lot of individuals, especially as your cardiovascular conditioning isn't very good initially, they start out at too high an intensity. So I think what a lot of powerlifters and strength athletes need to do is realize that they will get a significant stimulus just from walking. Incline walking, I have a lot of them start out with rucks where they simply put 25 to 45 pounds on their back and go for a hike and slowly start to build up their distance from there. I also have them make sure that they're not doing this every single day. They're only doing 1 or 2 long, slow days a week maximum and refueling a heck of a lot from those days, so eating a lot of food during the run or ruck, eating a lot before and afterwards. And then on the other end of the week, if they want to get a slightly different cardiovascular stimulus, that's when they do their high intensity training or their sprint work or their interval work or things like that.
Okay, so basically food and not going all out on cardio or their preferred method of endurance training would be would prevent them from losing strength significantly in the short term at least.
Exactly. And I mean, one of the biggest problems I found is just that is the food side of things, of course, is just not eating enough. And I think a lot of people don't realize just how many calories a 200 something pound person burns per mile.
Yeah.
And they really have to take that into account.
Yeah. Okay. So basically you're talking about your different training philosophies. What exactly, well, first of all, what training principles do you apply to yourself and then other people that are also in the powerlifting, triathlon, marathon niche? And then if you were to assign just a, yeah, and if you were just assign a powerlifter, and they just wanted to focus on general cardio, CVD performance, what would you do differently for the different groups?
So I think one of the biggest things, obviously, is everything is kind of a spectrum. It's a continuum, a varying degree of intensity. If you get your powerlifter who wants to do, an ultra marathon or a marathon or something similar, obviously, it's the volume and intensity of what they're going to have to do there is going to be a lot more significant versus the individual who just wants 2 or 3 30-minute sessions per week. My overall weekly structure is, one of the things I've talked about before is using the overall West Side model, not to the letter, not rotating the max effort lifts every week. And, certainly I don't think that every individual needs to do dynamic effort or speed work. But what I like about that particular model is the fact that it allows you to fluctuate between high intensity, relatively low volume during the week and, higher volume, hypertrophy type work at a lower intensity later in the week. And what that lets you do effectively is structure the cardiovascular training similarly. Okay. So I'll have individuals, say the beginning part of the week, regardless of what they're training for, do, say, their heavy max effort lifts and then do their sprint work and speed work in the beginning of the week. And then slowly as the week continues, they'll go more towards their, dynamic effort or volume lifting and at the same time their low intensity, high volume running. And that model more or less holds true for most individuals. The exceptions would be CrossFitters or military or anybody else who, quite frankly, can handle a huge amount of work. Okay. For them, it's much more consistent over the course of the week. Okay. But that's the general model that we use.
So that's for the cross blend powerlifter, ultramarathon runner. Okay, so then what differences would you make towards that person's training if they were just powerlifters or just into general strength training in their, I mean, obviously it depends on their level of training, but let's say they're, elite or advanced intermediates. or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, for a lot of guys like this, there's really no reason, and I talk about sport-specific work capacity. There's really no reason for them to do, high volume sprints or anything like that. In fact, I usually recommend against sprints for a lot of heavier individuals, just because it's a great way to tear a hamstring. But you could do bike intervals and things like that. But for the most part, for these pure power lifters, a lot of the stuff we recommend is just one or two moderate intensity, 20 to 30 minute sessions during the week, and then a single long, slow, long duration, slowly increasing in terms of distance and duration workout per week. I mean, it's very simple, very straightforward, very bare bones. But one of the things we also like to do is rotate the modalities that we use. For example, it's not always going to be running. It's not always going to be rucking. We can use rowing. We can use, some sort of swimming, even aqua jogging. The idea is, since these are larger individuals and perhaps not as practiced movements, they're very prone to overuse injuries. We get a lot of big guys out there who get shin splints after, their second run, which is why we'll then put them on the bike, put them on something else, and let them rotate that and keep that going, because to them, running is not important. What's important is the overall conditioning.
So do you feel that doing some sort of endurance exercise allows them to recover quicker from the day-to-day high-intensity powerlifting? Or do you think that they could just do the basic movements for their heart and then do other things for recovery, like mobility or different dynamic movements? Do you think what is better, in your opinion, for recovery?
There's certainly some carryover from the high intensity work, but I can't say necessarily that the powerlifter who's also a marathon runner is going to recover any faster than the powerlifter who just does 20 to 30 minutes of basic jogging, because a lot of that recovery, a lot of that local work capacity is very specific.
Yeah.
I always tell people at the end of the day, if one of the reasons why I'm against a lot of, say, tire flips, unless you happen to be a strongman, is, if you're a power lifter and you start doing tire flips, that's obviously exhausting the posterior chain, the hips, everything else. You're saying, well, why not just do another set of squats or deadlifts? So, I'm very much about specific stressors. So once you get past a certain point, I don't think there's any, huge inherent advantage. I said a lot of these folks, I just have them do really what I consider the minimum for health and minimum to really speed up recovery during a session and immediately afterwards, which again is maybe 3 30-minute sessions a week, if not a little more.
Yeah, and then they can do whatever they need for their specific recovery. Like if they get really tight or something, they can do that all separately. And so basically, they need to just make sure that their heart is okay. They're able to do normal, basic daily things. There's not a need to do anything like a marathon or even a 10-mile run. You just need to do something so that they can focus on their sport without having crazy problems occur in their life.
Exactly. And, I think the fun thing, though, is if they then decide that they want to do a 5K or a half marathon or something along those lines, once they've built that base, they can do it with minimum interference. And I think that's it at the end of the day is, besides obviously the health benefits, it's also just saying, well, maybe try something different.
Yeah.
Have a little fun with it.
Yeah. Okay, so I think that's really all we need to cover for this. Did a really good job. But before you go, I wanted to see basically why you started what you're doing with Complete Human Performance, and then maybe who are your biggest influences in powerlifting and your ultramarathon running and triathlon. Like, who inspired you to do this, and then why did you decide to do what you're doing right now?
I think one of the reasons it started was, I love strength sports with a passion. As soon as I graduated from college, I started lifting seriously, and really, really enjoyed it. I would do the occasional sprint and that kind of thing, but I felt terribly, generally out of shape. And I did my first 5K a number of years ago at this point, and I just remember that I felt slow. I didn't feel like an athlete. I didn't feel like I wanted to feel. And, I have a family history of heart disease. My grandfather had quintuple bypass surgery by the time before he was 60. And, you hear horror stories about a lot of these big, strong, robust individuals who they keel over at the age of 30. And I said, I don't want that to be me.
Yeah.
And that was certainly a big part of it, when I think about what initially got me out there running. But, obviously didn't want to compromise the strength sports. So I started sitting down and saying, well, how can I, through trial and error, a great deal of trial and error, how can this all come together? And, just in terms of influences, gosh, I'd have to say, even more so than any individuals who've actually inspired me, I would say it was very much members of my family who, basically just, I think, reminded me that yes, you can enjoy a sport, you can, push yourself really hard, but you've got to maintain some level of balance.
So yeah, and I think one of the problems with the beginner lifters is they don't know where to start, and then they don't have anyone to encourage them because a lot of times it's not as accepted to do some sort of specific sport,
Yeah,
and it's kind of hurts them individually. So they try to figure out something they can do and what's accepted, and sometimes what's accepted is not really going to help them in the long run, but it's
exactly.
definitely nice to have that online community, or what you said is your family definitely helps. So what would you recommend a beginner to do if they don't necessarily know which end of the spectrum they want to go? Like what would you recommend for them?
If the individual is interested in strength sports, I would tell them to pursue them, to pursue powerlifting, pursue strongman, but especially to keep their options open. I think, Chad Wesley Smith actually made a great point about how a lot of kids these days aren't doing as much of what you would call GPP, just the idea that kids used to play, they used to try a dozen different sports and everything else, and I think at the end of the day that makes for better athletes. I would tell aspiring strength athletes, don't just do powerlifting. Try strongman. Run the occasional 5K just for the heck of it. Do multiple things, and I think as a result you will be a better all-around athlete at the end of the day. And yes, you may not make the same gains in 6 months as you would just sticking to powerlifting or just sticking to running, but you'll leave your options open. I think you'll be a healthier, happier athlete. And if, God forbid, you get injured doing the sport that you love, you'll have something else you can fall back on and be equally good at.
Yeah, and then you don't get too obsessed with that one sport, or you don't isolate yourself from society because you're so obsessed with one thing. And at the time, you likely won't have too many people to influence you or agree with you on whatever you're doing.
Exactly. Well, and it's I realize it's great. I mean, because there are different communities. There's the powerlifting community, the strongman community, the trail running community. They're all very different kinds of people, different kinds of personalities, different things that drive them.
Yeah,
And I think mentally, it's good to have exposure to different kinds of athletes.
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, awesome, man. I really appreciate it, Alex. If anybody else wants to learn more about Alex, they can go to completehumanperformance.com. It's been great talking to you. Maybe we can
Likewise.
get some more in the future.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, awesome. Peace.